the UK is headed for what many call the closest general election in decades. Stuart Theobald joins us from Leriba Consulting, and he's with us via Skype. Of course, I am still with Byron Lotter. Stuart, thanks so much for your time. What would you say is the magic number for an overall majority?
Well, we're not going to get an overall majority. This is going to be a question of which party gets the most votes. And that's going to be a party somewhere in the 30%. And according to the latest polls, it looks like the Conservatives have a few points ahead of Labour in that race. But even the day before the election, it's still far too close to call.
Stuart, what are the chances of, say, for example, the Conservatives get more votes than the Labour, but the Labour Party are slightly more influential and smart about their coalitions and end up getting the majority through that? So essentially what the electorate wanted, they haven't got at all. What are the chances of that?
I think that we're going to end up with a coalition, that's for sure. I think it's incredibly difficult how the parties go about putting those coalitions together. And indeed, it can fail entirely, and then we end up with a minority government. The issues, the position allows the smaller parties, so largely the Liberal Democrats and UKIP, which will each end up with, if they're lucky, 10%, but probably less than that. And those two parties become very important in the coalition because whoever manages to court them onto their side is going to have the strength to pull together a coalition government. So their policy positions, and I should add the Greens and the Scottish National Party are then the next two in the tiers, and they become more important. So what's really interesting about this election is that the smaller parties are probably more important than they've ever been before in an election because they can be the kingmakers through the efforts of the parties to form a coalition to set up a government.
Stuart, of course, there are various issues at the moment that are driving votes. How much would you say the immigration issue has affected votes?
Immigration is hugely important. It's one of the areas where the smaller party, particularly UKIP, has played its hand most strongly. It certainly tapped into a feeling in Britain that immigration is somehow out of control and somehow damaging to the country. UKIP's played that card very aggressively, and as a result of that, it's forced other parties to be much more serious about immigration than I suspect they would be in their heart of hearts. So we've seen quite a bit of rhetoric from both the Conservatives and Labour about what they would also do about immigration, both emphasizing that they recognize that skilled immigration is good for the country, but talking tough about illegal immigration and unskilled immigration, and also immigrants' access to benefits once they arrive in Britain. Now, this was, I think, as a policy platform, went a bit quiet after the tragedies in the Mediterranean of the various accidents that led to hundreds of deaths of immigrants trying desperately to get into Europe. And I think in an effort not to appear quite transparently callous, the politicians went a bit quiet about immigration after that. And I think that news has somewhat dampened immigration as a political issue going into the election now.
Just a little bit of a less technical question. From what I've been watching and following with the elections, apparently social media has become really more influential, and the specific campaigns have their own Twitter accounts, and big names like Russell Brand have supported specific parties and with their own YouTube channels. What kind of a influence, or do you think it's been a really significant influence in terms of swaying voters?
I think one of the problems that the parties have is how do they mobilize particularly younger voters? There's very low turnouts in these elections, particularly by anybody kind of in their early 20s. And using social media is seen as a way to reach out, particularly to that part of the public who are not particularly interested in politics, couldn't be bothered to go out and even find where their voting stations are or register to vote. So social media has played that role, and and people like Russell Brand have traction in those communities. Britain, though, is a fairly aging population compared to somewhere like South Africa, which is a very young population. So it's questionable, I think, how much traction social media can really have when a lot of the voters are sort of are older, more established, and have a long history of engagement with parties through other forums. But social media has been very important in terms of getting to that part of the public that's just disinterested in politics and hasn't in the past voted or maybe not, needs real encouragement to get to the polling stations.
Stuart, thanks for that. That was Stuart Theobald. He's from Leriba Consulting. And